Welcome to Stories Cafe. I'm your host for today's delightful mystery, set in the quaint village of Farnham, where we join Miss Jane Marple in the case of the painted teacups. Before we unravel the tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. Share your location in the comments. Settle in with a steaming cup of tea, hone your keen eye for detail, and let's uncover the secrets hidden in delicate porcelain and wartime whispers. The invitation had arrived on a Tuesday morning, penned in Mrs. Bantry's exuberant scrawl across lavender-scented cream notepaper. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her spectacles, reading it once more as the train eased into Farnham Station, the soothing clatter of wheels giving way to the soft hiss of steam and the porter's lively call. "Do come for a fortnight, Jane," Dolly had written. "My cousin Maud has the most charming cottage here, and the village is utterly delightful. There's a garden party on Saturday, and I'm simply dying to introduce you to everyone. The countryside is divine, and I think the change of air will do you good after that dreadful business with the vicarage murders." Miss Marple smiled faintly, gathering her knitting bag and modest suitcase. Dear Dolly had a knack for framing even the most shocking events as mere social hiccups. Stepping carefully onto the platform, she noted with approval the neatly tended flower boxes and the station's fresh coat of paint. Farnham was clearly a village that cherished its polished charm. "Miss Marple, oh, how perfectly splendid that you've come." The voice belonged to a tall, angular woman with graying hair, swept into an elegant chignon, her flowered dress hinting at pre-war elegance. Mrs. Bantry hurried forward, arms outstretched, her face alight with genuine warmth. "Dolly, my dear," Miss Marple said fondly, accepting the embrace. "How very kind of you to invite me. The journey was most pleasant. Maud is simply thrilled you're here," Dolly gushed, leading the way. "She's heard all about your little adventures in detection, though, of course, we mustn't dwell on such grim matters." Things in polite company, Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice a conspiratorially, "though I must say there are the most interesting people in Farnham. Wait until you meet Miss Blundell's artist, you know. She has the sharpest tongue and the keenest eye for local affairs." Nothing escapes her notice. As they walked along the village's main street, Miss Marple observed the neat row of cottages with their well-maintained gardens, the baker's shop with its cheerful striped awning, and the ancient church with its Norman tower rising beyond a cluster of elm trees. It was, she reflected, exactly the sort of English village that appeared in watercolor paintings and tourist brochures, peaceful, prosperous, and prettily preserved. The Bantry cousins' cottage proved to be a charming structure of honey-cold Cotswold stone with climbing roses around the front door and a garden that showed the loving attention of someone who understood both beauty and practicality. Miss Marad Wetherb, a plump woman with kind ice and flower-dusted hands, welcomed Miss Marple with the sort of genuine warmth that made her feel immediately at home Saturdays. Garden party was held at Rosemary Cottage, the home of Miss Verity Blundell, and Miss Marple found herself genuinely curious about their hostess, even before the introductions were made. The cottage itself was larger than most in the village, with an enviable position, overlooking both the village green and the surrounding countryside. More significantly, it boasted a purpose-built studio in the garden, a modern addition that spoke of serious artistic ambition rather than mere dabbling. Miss Blundell herself proved to be a woman of perhaps 60, with silver hair drawn back, severely lined, pale blue eyes that seemed to miss very little. She moved through her guests with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention, offering remarks that were invariably clever and occasionally rather sharp. "So you're the famous Miss Marple," she said when Mrs. Bantry performed the introduction. "Dolly has told me the most extraordinary stories. about your involvement in various criminal matters. How fascinating that such traumatic events should find their way to quiet villages. Oh, I fear. Dear Mrs. Bantry rather exaggerates. Miss Marple, replegently. One simply observes, human nature is much the same everywhere, whether in St. Mary me or London. Miss Blundell's pale eyes sharpened with interest. Indeed, and what do you observe here in Ferncombe? Miss Marple, before Miss Marple could respond, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a nervous-looking young woman with dark hair and an anxious expression. A verity I do. Hope I'm not late. The bus from Little Wickham was delayed. And Patricia, my dear Childyar, perfectly punctual. Miss Blundell said, though her tone suggested mild irritation. Miss Marple, may I present mine? Niece Patricia Hume. Patricia. This is the celebrated Miss Marple, whom Dolly has been telling us about. Miss Marple noted the slight tension in the young woman's shoulders, and the way her eyes darted nervously between her aunt and the other guests. Financial worries, she thought, recognizing the particular strain that comes from mounting debts and diminishing options. The afternoon progressed pleasantly enough, with cucumber sandwiches and seed cakes served on delicate china, and conversations that touched on village affairs, the weather, and the gradual return to normality after the wars. And Miss Marple found herself particularly intrigued by the various undercurrents she observed. The way the vicar, Mr. Stainton, seemed unusually interested in Miss Blundell's artistic work, and how a well-dressed gentleman introduced as MRFORISCU kept steering conversations toward property values and developmental porosity. Such a shame about the old mill, Mr. Fortescue was saying to a small group near the refreshment table. Prime location, that with proper development it could provide much-needed housing for young families. Over my dead body, Miss Blundell interjected crisply from across the garden. This village has quite enough charm without your modern monstrosities cluttering the landscape. The silence that followed was distinctly uncomfortable, and Miss Marple noticed how several guests suddenly found their teacups fascinating. Mr. Fortescue's face flushed slightly, but he managed a tight smile. Progress is inevitable, Miss Blundell, even in Ferncombe. As the afternoon drew to a close and guests began to take their leave, Miss Marple lingered in the garden studio, admiring the watercolors display on various easels. Miss Blundell's work was indeed accomplished village scenes, rendered with remarkable attention to detail and almost photographic accuracy in capturing local landmarks. Most intriguing of all was a series of 6 small teacups, each hand-painted with a different village scene. The work was exquisite, showing Miss Blundell's talent for miniature detail, and Mrs. Marple found herself studying each cup with growing fascination. The scenes depicted various aspects of Ferncombe life: the church, the Village Green, the railway station, the old mill, and the war memorial. Each painting told a story, she realized, capturing not just buildings and landscapes, but moments in the village's history. Walking back to Maud's cottage in the gentle evening light, Miss Marple reflected on the afternoon's observations. Ferncombe might appear to be the picture of rural tranquility, but beneath a charming surface, she had detected the familiar tensions that seem to exist in every community: financial pressures, conflict, ambitions, and the sort of personal animosities that could simmer for years before reaching a dangerous boiling point. Chapter 2. The Studio of Secret Sunday. Morning dawned with the particular brightness that often follows a thunderstorm, though Miss Marple could not recall hearing any rain during the night. She had slept remarkably well at Maud's cottage, lulled by the profound quiet that only true countryside could provide. After a peaceful breakfast of fresh eggs and homemade preserves, she settled in the garden with her knitting, enjoying the play of light through the apple trees and the distant sound of church bells calling the faithful to morning service. It was therefore all the more shocking when Mrs. Crump came running down the lane at 10 her usual, compacetaminer entirely abandoned. The daily help was a stout woman of middle years who took evident pride in her reputation for reliability and discretion. To see her rushing through the village in obvious distress, her hat askew and her face flushed with exertion, was sufficiently unusual to bring several residents to their front gates. "Oh, Miss Weather, Mrs. Bantry," she called out as she reached the cottage garden. "Something terrible has happened at Rosemary Cottage. It's Miss Blundell. Oh dear Lord, she's dead." Miss Marple sat down, her knitting with deliberate care, her mind immediately alert. Mrs. Bantry Woe had been deadheading roses nearby, dropped her secrets with a clatter. "Dead Mrs. Bantry," repeated faintly, "but that's impossible. We saw her only yesterday at the garden party. She was perfectly well." Mrs. Crump wrung her hands, struggling to catch her breath. "I went round as usual this morning to do the Sunday tidying. Front door was locked, but I have my key. You know, I called out as I always do, but there was no answer. Thought perhaps she'd overslept, so I went about my business. But when I went to empty the newspaper basket in the studio, she broke off, pressing a handkerchief to her trembling lips. "My dear woman, sit down," Miss Marple said gently, rising from her chair. "Maud, perhaps a glass of water." Mrs. Crump accepted the glass gratefully, but continued her account in a shaking voice. She was in the studio, lying on the floor, near her easel. "At first I thought she'd had a fall, but then I saw her face was all blue and horrible, and there were marks on her neck. Someone had strangled her as sure as I'm sitting here." The gravity of the situation settled over the small group. Like a heavy blanket, Miss Marple found herself thinking of the various tensions she had observed at yesterday's garden party. The sharp exchanges, the underlying animosities, the careful politeness that often masked deeper conflicts. "Have you telephoned the police?" she asked quietly. "I ran straight to the vicarage first, but Mr. Stainton was still conducting the service. Then I came herring out, knowing what else to do." Mrs. Crump looked helplessly between the three women. "I've never seen anything so dreadful in my life." Mrs. Bantry had recovered her composure sufficiently to take charge. "We must telephone the police immediately, Maraud. You stay with Mrs. Crump. Jane and I will go to Rosemary Cottage to ensure nothing is disturbed before the authorities arrive." The walk to Miss Blundell's cottage seemed longer than usual, though it could not have taken more than 5 minutes. The building looked exactly as it had the previous afternoon, peaceful, well-maintained, having no external indication of the tragedy within. Miss Marple noted that the front garden showed no signs of disturbance, and the windows all appeared to be properly secured. They found the front door unlocked, as Mrs. Crump had left it in her haste to seek help. The interior of the cottage was neat and undisturbed, showing the effects of Mrs. Crump's regular attention. Nothing appeared to have been stolen or ransacked. It was only when they reached the garden studio that the true horror of the situation became apparent. Miss Verity Blundell lay crumpled beside her easel, her silver hair disheveled, and her pale blue eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. The marks on her throat were clearly visible. Her face bore the unmistakable signs of strangulation. Miss Marple forced herself to look beyond the immediate tragedy to observe the scene with the detached attention that such situations required. The easel had been knocked askew, and an overturned chair suggested there had been some sort of struggle. More puzzling was the arrangement of objects on the work near the window, the set of 6 painted teacups that Miss Marple had admired the previous day were prominently displayed, but only 5 remained. The 6th cup, the one that had depicted the war memorial, if she remembered correctly, was nowhere to be seen. How very odd, Miss Marple murmured, moving carefully around the studio without disturbing anything. "What's odd?" Mrs. Bantry asked, though she seemed reluctant to look too closely at the scene. The Teacups, my dear yesterday there, were 6 in the set, each painted, with a different village scene. Now there are only 5, and they've been arranged in a very deliberate pattern. Indeed, the remaining cups were positioned in a neat row as if someone had examined them carefully. Miss Marple studied the painted scenes. On each cup, the church, the village green, the railway station, the old mill, and what appeared to be a street scene from the village center. The missing cup, she was now certain, had depicted the war memorial, and the surrounding area, the sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of official inspector Dermot Crouch. A young man with intelligent eyes and a serious demeanor had driven over from the county police headquarters. He took one look at the scene and immediately began organizing the investigation. With brisk efficiency, "I'll need everyone to leave the studio immediately," he announced. "This is now a crime scene, and nothing must be disturbed until the photographer and police surgeon have completed their work." Mrs. Bantry began to introduce Miss Marple, but the inspector cut her short with professional courtesy. "I'm sure the ladies have been most helpful, but I must ask you to return to your homes while we conduct our initial examination. We'll need statements from everyone in due course." As they walked back toward the cottage, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the careful arrangement of the teacups and the significance of the missing 6th cup. In her experience, when something was taken from a crime scene, it was usually because it contained information that someone desperately needed to hide. But what could a delicately painted teacup possibly reveal that was worth killing for? The quiet morning had been shattered by violence, and Miss Marple knew from long experience that when murder came to a village, it usually exposed secrets that had been carefully buried for years. Someone in Ferncombe had killed Verity Blundell, and the missing teacup was somehow connected to their motive. The investigation was about to begin in earnest, and Miss Marple suspected that the peaceful facade of village life was about to be thoroughly examined and found wanting. In her knitting bag, her needles clicked softly as she began a new pattern in her mind, already working on the puzzle that had been so brutally presented to them all. Chapter 3: Portraits of Suspicion. By Monday afternoon, the news of Miss Blundell's murder had spread throughout Ferncombe with the peculiar efficiency that characterizes village communication. Inspector Crouch had established himself in the small parlor of the Red Lion Inn, from where he conducted a series of interviews that gradually revealed the complex web of relationships and grievances that had surrounded the deceased artist Miss Marple, maintaining her usual practice of quiet observation, found herself privy to much of the subsequent gossip through the simple expedient of taking her afternoon walks at strategic times and accepting the numerous invitations to tea that seemed to multiply in the wake of tragedy. It was remarkable. She reflected how eager people became to share confidences when faced with the unsettling reality of murder in their midst. The first significant revelation came through Mrs. Crump herself, who had recovered sufficiently from her shock to provide a detailed account of recent events at Rosemary Cottage. Miss Marple encountered the daily help at the village shop, where Mrs. Crump was purchasing blackage notepaper with the obvious intention of writing condolence letters. Such a terrible business, Mrs. Crump confided, glancing around to ensure they would not be overheard. "And I must say, Miss Marple, there had been some unpleasantness recently. Just last week, Miss Patricia came to see her aunt, and my word, the voices that were raised I couldn't help but hear. You understand, being in the kitchen at the time." Miss Marple made appropriately sympathetic sounds while selecting some wool for her fitting money troubles. "It was," Mrs. Crump continued, lowering her voice, "further, Miss Patricia's husband died in the war, poor soul, and she's been struggling terribly ever since she'd come to ask her aunt for help. But Miss Blundell, well, she could be quite sharp about financial matters. Learn to live within your means." she said quite loudly. "I won't throw good money after bad." Those were her exact words. This intelligence proved enlightening when Miss Marple encountered Patricia Hume herself the following day. The young woman was emerging from the post office, with red-rimmed eyes and a generally disheveled appearance that spoke of sleepless nights and considerable distress. "Oh, Miss Marple," Patricia said, attempting a wan smile. "How dreadful that your visit to Ferncon should be spoiled by such terrible events. You must think our village quitournivilized." "My dear child," Miss Marple replied gently, "trade can strike anywhere it has. Nothing to do with the character of a place or its people. You mustn't distress yourself unnecessarily." Patricia's composure wavered visibly. "But you see, everyone knows that Aunt Verity and I, that we hadn't been getting along recently. There are bound to be questions about her will, about who benefits from her death. The cottage alone must be worth a considerable sum. And with my circumstances being what they are," she broke off, clearly realizing she had said more than was wise. Miss Marple observed the young woman's genuine distress with sympathy, noting the worn quality of her clothes and the careful way she clutched her worn handbag. "These matters will sort themselves out in due course," Miss Marple said kindly. "The truth has a way of emerging, particularly when there are honest people willing to speak it." That afternoon brought a different sort of revelation when Miss Marple accepted Mrs. Bantry's suggestion that they call upon the vicarage. Mr. Stainton proved to be a man of perhaps 50, with prematurely gray hair and the sort of nervous energy that suggested a temperament ill-suited to pastoral calm. His obvious agitation at their visit was poorly concealed behind offers of tea and anxious inquiries about their comfort. "Such a shock for the entire community," he said, fidgeting with his teacup. Miss Blundell was, that is to say, she was a woman of strong opinions and considerable artistic talent. "Her loss will be deeply felt," Mrs. Bantry never won for subtle approaches, addressed the matter directly. "We understand you had been visiting her studio quite frequently in recent weeks, Mr. Stainton. Such dedication to supporting local artists is admirable." The vicar's cup rattled against its saucer as he set it down hastily. "Yes, well, one tries to take an interest in the cultural life of the parish." Miss Blundell's work was quite remarkable, particularly her historic alcibics. Some of her wartime paintings were most illuminating. Miss Marple noticed the beads of perspiration on the man's forehead, despite the coolness of the afternoon. Historical accuracy can be so important, she observed mildly. Artists often capture details that others might overlook or prefer to forget. "Quite so," Mr. Stainton agreed, though his voice had risen slightly, "which is why I had that is, I had discussed with Miss Blundell the possibility of acquiring certain pieces for the church's collection. Paintings of historical significance should be properly preserved. Don't you think?" The third strand of the emerging pattern revealed itself through Miss Marple's encounter with M.R. Clement Fortescue, the property developer who had spoken so confidently about progress at Saturday's garden party. She met him quite by chance outside the Red Lion, where he appeared to be waiting for someone with barely concealed impatience. "Terrible business about Miss Blundell," he said without preamble, apparently recognizing her from the party. "Not the sort of thing one expects in a respectable village. Bad for property values, this kind of notoriety." Miss Marple murmured, appropriately sympathetic response while observing the man's expensive suit and confident demeanor. Mr. Fortescue was clearly someone accustomed to getting his own way through a combination of charm and determination. "Of course, life must go on," he continued, warming to his theme. "The village needs modern development, proper housing for young families. Miss Blundell's cottage, for instance, prime location, that whoever inherits it would be wise to consider their options carefully. I understand Miss Blundell was quite opposed to development in the village." Miss Marple ventured. Mr. Fortescue's genial expression hardened slightly. Miss Blundell was a woman of fixed ideas. She failed to understand the economic realities of the modern world. Progress cannot be stopped indefinitely by sentimental attachment to the past. As Miss Marple walked back to Maud's cottage in the fading afternoon light, she reflected on the three distinct motives that had emerged from her conversations. Patricia Hume stood to inherit substantially from her aunt's death, potentially solving her desperate financial situation. The Reverend Stainton had clearly been anxious to acquire specific paintings from Miss Blundell's collection, though his reasons remained unclear. Mr. Fortescue had obvious commercial interests that would be furthered by the artist's death and the subsequent sale of her strategically liquidated property. Yet something about the careful arrangement of the remaining teacups continued to trouble her. In her experience, when someone removed evidence from a crime scene, it was usually because that evidence could directly implicate them. The missing teacup had depicted the war memorial and its surroundings, but what could such a scene possibly reveal that was worth killing? For the puzzle was becoming more complex rather than clearer, and Miss Marple suspected that the true motive for Verity Blundell's murder lay deeper than obvious explanations of money, property, or artistic acquisition. Someone in Furnham was harboring a secret significant enough to drive them to murder, and until that secret was uncovered, no one in the village could truly feel safe. Chapter 4, Patterns in Porcelain. Tuesday morning brought with it a development that Miss Marple had been quietly hoping for. Inspector Crack, having completed his initial examination of the crime scene, had released the studio for cleaning. Thoth Cottage itself remained sealed pending further investigation. Mrs. Crump, despite her obvious distress, had volunteered to oversee the careful packing of Miss Blundell's artistic materials and personal effects. It seems only proper, she explained to Miss Marple when they encountered each other at the village green. Miss Patricia is far too upset to deal with such things, and there's no one else who knows where everything belongs. The inspector said I might pack the paintings and such, provided I make a careful list of everything. Miss Marple expressed her sympathy for such a melancholy task, while privately recognizing an excellent opportunity to examine the studio more thoroughly when she mentioned this conversation to Mrs. Bantry over their morning tea. Her friend immediately grasped the significance. Of course, you must defer to help, Mrs. Bantry declared with characteristic decisiveness. Poor Mrs. Crump shouldn't have to manage such a burden alone, and your organizational skills would be invaluable in such circumstances. Thus it was that Miss Marple found herself in Verity Blundell's studio that afternoon, carefully wrapping paintings in brown paper, while Mrs. Crump sorted through brushes and painting supplies. The studio had been thoroughly examined by the police, but Miss Marple's strained eye noticed details that might have escaped official attention. The 5 remaining teacups had been moved to a shelf near the window where the afternoon light revealed the extraordinary delicacy of their painted decoration. Miss Marple examined each cup with growing fascination, marveling at the artist's meticulous attention to detail. Each scene was rendered with almost photographic precision, capturing not merely the physical appearance of village landmarks, but something of their character and atmosphere. Miss Blund was working on these right up until the end, Mrs. Crump observed, joining Miss Marple at the window. She'd been at them for weeks, adding tiny details and adjusting the colors. Particular about her work, she was nothing left the studio until it was exactly as she wanted it. The cup depicting the church showered the building during what appeared to be a winter morning, with frost on the gravestones and smoke rising from the vicarage chimney. Every stone in the ancient walls was individually painted, and tiny figuresques could be seen moving about their morning tasks. Miss Marple recognized Mrs. Crump, herself identifiable by her distinctive blue coat sweeping the church steps. How remarkably detailed, Miss Marple murmured. One can almost count the individual paving stones. That is nothing to what she could do when she really set her mind to it. Mrs. Crump replied with evident pride. The missing cup, the one with the war memorial, why, you could make out every name carved on the stone, and all the wreaths laid out for Remembrance Day. She'd spent hours getting the shadows just right, showing how the light fell across the memorial at different times of day. Miss Marple set down the church cup. With careful deliberation, Remembrance Day. You say how interesting that she should choose that particular occasion to paint. Oh, it wasn't just one scene, Mrs. Crump explained, warming to her subject. She'd been working on a whole series about the war. Years how the village looked during the blackout, the Home Guard exercises, the evacuees arriving at the station. Said she wanted to record history before people forgot what it was really like. This intelligence proved most illuminating. Miss Marple continued her examination of the remaining cups, noting how each one captured a specific moment in village life with remarkable precision. The railway station scene showed a crowded platform with people in wartime clothing, while the village green depicted what appeared to be a home guard drill with local men in uniform practicing their maneuvers. Mrs. Trump. Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "You mentioned that Miss Blundell painted from life. Did she make sketches outdoors or work from memory?" "Both, really. She had dozens of sketchbooks filled with drawings from over the years. Sometimes she'd sit in the churchyard or on the green for hours, just watching and drawing. Nothing escaped her eye. She once painted a picture of the post office that showed young Tommy Fletcher stealing apples from Mrs. Henderson's basket, though she'd only glimpsed it for a moment." Miss Marple found herself thinking of a similar situation in Estimary Me, where an artist's careful observation had inadvertently captured evidence of wrongdoing. Artists do see things that others miss, she observed mildly. Their trained eye notices details that the rest of us might overlook entirely. That's exactly what she used to say, Mrs. Crump agreed. Said painting taught her to really look at things, not just glance at them. She could spot a fake antique at 20 paces, or tell you if someone was wearing a wig, or notice when people were behaving differently from usual. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the studio door. Reverend Staton stood on the threshold, his face bearing an expression of anxious concern. "I do hope I'm not intruding," he said, though his eyes immediately went to the shelf with the teacups where he displayed. "I wanted to express my condolences to Mrs. Crump and to inquire whether Miss Blundell's paintings might be available for viewing. The parish has been discussing a possibility of mounting a memorial exhibition." Miss Marple observed the vicar's obvious nervousness with interest. His gaze lingered on Teacups with what appeared to be relief, though she could not immediately understand why. "Most thoughtful of you, Reverend." Mrs. Crump replied, "though I believe such decisions will rest with Miss Patricia, being the heir and all." Of course, Mr. State agreed hastily. "I merely wanted to ensure that Miss Blundell's artistic legacy receives proper recognition. Her historical paintings were particularly valuable documents of 4 communities past. One might say." He lingered for several more minutes, making stilted conversation, while his eyes repeatedly returned to the painted cups. Miss Marple noted his particular interest in the scene depicting the village green, though she could not discern what about that innocent pastoral scene might cause him such evident concern. After the vicar's departure, Miss Marple returned to her examination of Teacups with renewed purpose. If Verity Blundell had indeed possessed Theodist's gift for noticing details that others missed, and if she had began documenting village life during the war years with photographic precision, then it was entirely possible that she had inadvertently captured something that someone desperately wanted to remain hidden. The missing 6th cup had depicted the war memorial and its surroundings during Remembrance Day, but what could such a scene possibly contain that was worth killing? For Miss Marple found herself remembering the long shadows that Mrs. Crump had mentioned, and how light could reveal details that might otherwise remain obscured. As she carefully wrapped each remaining cup in tissue paper, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of secrets and the lengths to which people will go to protect them. In her experience, the most dangerous secrets were often those that seemed innocent on surface but carried implications that could destroy lives and reputations. Somewhere in Verity Blundell's meticulous documentation of village life lay the key to her murder, and Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that the answer might be found not in what the missing cup showed, but in who it revealed. Chapter 5 echoes from Fewer Wednesday brought a development that proved most illuminating, though it came about through this sort of chance encounter that Miss Marple had learned to value highly in her. Informal in the stations, she was returning from an early morning walk when she encountered old Mr. Pembridge, a gentleman of 80-some years who had been tending the war memorial with obvious care and attention. Beautiful morning, she observed, pausing to admire the carefully tended flower beds that surrounded the stone monument. Indeed it is, Mr. Pembridge replied, straightening slowly from his work. Though I must say this business about poor Miss Blundell has cast a shadow over the whole village. Terrible thing, murder. Makes one think about the past, about other dark times we've weathered. Miss Marple expressed appropriate sympathy, while noting the old gentleman's obvious desire to talk. In her experience, elderly people often possess the most valuable insights into community history, particularly regarding events that others might prefer to forget. I suppose the war years were difficult for everyone, she ventured gently. Mr. Pembridge's weathered face grew thoughtful. Difficult times indeed. Miss Marple brought out the best in some people, and he paused, glancing around to ensure they were not overheard. Well, perhaps it's unkind to speak ill of anyone, but the war brought out rather different qualities in others. Human nature reveals itself most clearly under pressure. Miss Marple agreed. Imagine a small village like Fernham had its share of both heroism and less admirable behavior. You put your finger on it exactly, the old man said, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. Most folks here did their bit and more, but there were those who saw opportunity where others saw duty. Black market dealings, information passed to the wrong people, young women led astray, and then abandoned when the consequences became inconvenient. Miss Marple's attention sharpened at this last observation. How tragic when the vulnerable are taken advantage of during such uncertain times. There was a girl, Mr. Pembridge accounted, his voice heavy with old sorrow. Pretty little thing, worked at the post office during the war. Got herself in trouble with one of the men billeted here. Claimed he'd promised to marry her, but of course that came to nothing when her condition became obvious. She simply disappeared one night, found her body in the river 3 weeks later. How dreadful, Miss Marple murmured, though she sensed there was more to this tragic story. The official verdict was accident, of course. Poor girl slipped and fell, they said, but there were those of us who wondered. She'd been asking questions, you see, about the father of her child. Said she had proof of promises made, letters written. Then suddenly she was gone, and her few belongings had been cleared out of her room before anyone could examine them properly. This intelligence proved most disturbing, particularly when Miss Marple learned more details during her afternoon visit with Mrs. Crump. The Daily Help had agreed to tea at Maud's cottage, partly from gratitude for Miss Marple's assistance with the studio clearance and partly from an obvious need to share her memories with someone who would listen sympathetically. Rose M. Tier, her name was Mrs. Crump, recalled. When Mrs. Marple delicately broached the subject of wartime tragedies, sweet girl, no more than 19 when it happened. She'd been so excited about her young man, showed everyone his photograph, talked constantly about their wedding plans. Then when she told him about the baby, he turned cold as winter. How heartbreaking for the poor child, Miss Marple observed. Did she never reveal the identity of the father? Mrs. Crump glanced around nervously. Before answering, she did Totos, who'd listened. But he was someone with influence, someone people respected when she started making accusations. Folks said she was just a hysterical girl trying to trap a man above her station. And Miss Blundell, did she know of this tragedy? Oh yes, Miss Blundell knew all about it. She was young herself, then just starting her career as an artist. She'd made friends with Rose, actually used to sketch her sometimes, said she had the perfect face for watercolor ports. Miss Blundell was quite upset when Rose died, insisted it wasn't an accident. Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing unease. A pattern was beginning to emerge from the shadows of Fernham's wartime, past a pattern that suggested corruption, exploitation, and quite possibly murder. Mrs. Crump, she said carefully, you mentioned that Miss Blundell had been working on paintings of the war years. Did any of these works depict events connected to this tragedy? The older woman's face grew troubled. There was one painting she'd done recently, a scene of the Home Guard exercises on Fevilage Green. She'd been working from old sketches and photographs, trying to get all the details exactly right. Said it was important to record things as they really were, not as people might prefer to remember them. And this painting included recognizable individuals. Oh yes, she was very particular about getting the faces right. Spent hours with all photographs, making sure every uniform and every person was exactly as they'd been said. History shouldn't be sanitized for comfort's sake. Miss Marple found herself thinking again of the missing teacup and its depiction of the war memorial during Remembrance Day. If Verity Blundell had indeed been documenting wartime events with photographic precision, including the faces and actions of specific individuals, then it was entirely possible that she had inadvertently captured evidence of activities that Simeon desperately wanted to keep hidden. The conversation was interrupted by Inspector Crock's arrival. At the cottage, the young officer looked tired and frustrated, bearing the expression of someone whose investigation had encountered unexpected complications. I do hope you ladies won't mind, he said formally, but I understand Mrs. Crump has been most helpful in organizing Miss Blundell's effects. I wondered if she might have noticed anything unusual among the deceased papers or personal items. Mrs. Crump shook her head regretfully. Nothing that seemed important to me, Inspector. Just the usual things. Household accounts, letters from art suppliers. That sort of thing, though. I did notice that her old sketchbooks from the war years seemed to have some pages missing, torn out. Quite neatly, they were. This intelligence clearly surprised the inspector, who made careful notes while questioning Mrs. Crump about the missing sketches. Miss Marple observed this growing concern with interest, recognizing the signs of an investigation that had taken an unexpected turn. After the inspector's departure, Miss Marple walked slowly back through the village, her mind working over the various threads of information. She had gathered the picture that ways merging suggested that Verity Blundell's murder was connected to events that had occurred more than 5 years earlier. Events involving corruption, exploitation, quite possibly the death of an innocent young woman. Someone in Ferncombe was harboring secrets from the war years, secrets significant enough to drive them to murder when faced with the possibility of exposure through an artist's meticulous documentation. The missing teacup and Fettern pages from sketchbooks suggested a desperate attempt to erase evidence of past wrongdoing. As she paused again at the war memorial, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of memory and guilt. The names carved in stone commemorated those who had died in service to their country, but she was beginning to suspect that Ferncombe harbored memories of a different sort of death, one that had been carefully concealed but never truly forgotten. Chapter 6. The Vicar's Dilemma. Thursday afternoon brought with it an unexpected invitation that Miss Marple accepted with considerable interest. The Reverend Mr. Stainton had called at Moore's cottage to request somewhat awkwardly that Miss Marple might assist with organizing a parish meeting to discuss the proposed memorial. exhibition of Miss Blundell's work. His nervous manner and obvious reluctance to meet their eyes suggested that this was not the true purpose of his visit. Most kind of you to think of me, Miss Marple replied gently, though I fear my acquaintance with the village is rather limited for such an undertaking. Oh, but Mrs. Bantry speaks so highly of your organizational abilities. The vicar insisted, his hands fidgeting with his prayer book, and your experience with that is to say your understanding of delicate situations will be invaluable in determining which of Miss Blundell's works would be most suitable for public display. The subtle emphasis on suitability did not escape Miss Marple's attention. She agreed to accompany him to the vicarage for tea, where they might discuss the matter more thoroughly. The vicarage proved to be a rambling Victorian structure, somewhat shabby, but comfortable, with a peculiar atmosphere of controlled chaos that characterized homes where intellectual pursuits took precedence over domestic order. Mrs. Stainton, a thin, anxious woman with graying hair, welcomed Miss Marple with obvious relief at having another lady present to assist with the social niceties. Such a terrible business about poor Miss Blundell, she said, pouring tea from a service that had clearly seen better days. Richard has been quite beside himself with worry about the parish response. These things do so unsettle people's faith, don't they? Miss Marple murmured appropriate sympathies while observing the vicar's continued agitation. When Mrs. Stainton excused herself to attend to parish correspondence, Mr. Stainton's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. Miss Marple, he said, abruptly setting down his teacup with trembling hands, I must confess that I am in a most difficult position. I have information that may be relevant to the police investigation, but sharing it would violate confidences that I am bound by. Sacred duty to protect. The burden of the confessional can be very heavy, Miss Marple observed gently, though I believe the Church recognizes certain circumstances where the greater good must be considered. It's not a formal confession, Mr. Stainton replied, running his hands through his thinning hair, but it involves matters that's a man shared with me in confidence, seeking spiritual guidance. If this information became public, it would destroy an innocent person's reputation, and perhaps their life. Miss Marple waited patiently for him to continue, recognizing the signs of a man wrestling with his conscience. Miss Blundell had been persistent in her inquiries about certain events from the war years, he continued finally. She claimed to be documenting history, but her questions were becoming increasingly specific. She had somehow learned details about situations that were supposed to remain private matters, involving moral failings that had been confessed and forgiven years ago. Artists do tend to be observant, Miss Marple remarked mildly. Their trained eye often notices connections that others might miss. Precisely the problem. Stainton agreed, his voice heavy with distress. Miss Blundell's paintings were extraordinary detailed. She had captured scenes, faces, interactions that, while that some people will prefer, remained forgotten. Her wartime sketches were particularly literal. In this regard, Miss Marple found herself thinking of the missing pages from Verity Blundell's sketchbooks. Was someone attempting to purchase these particular works from Miss Blundell? The vicar's uncomfortable silence provided its own answer. After a long moment, he continued with obvious reluctance, I had hoped to acquire certain pieces for the church collection. Yes, not for any improper purpose, you understand, but to ensure they were properly preserved. Some artistic works are, perhaps too valuable as historical documents to be left in private hands. And Miss Blundell's response to these overtures, she was adamant that her work sold remain complete and unedited, said she had a responsibility, historical truth that superseded personal comfort or reputation. She seemed to take a rather unseemly pleasure in the discomfort her accuracy caused certain individuals. Miss Marple absorbed this information while observing the vicar's obvious distress. His genuine anguish suggested that his concern was indeed for someone else's welfare. rather than his own, though she could not yet determine whose secret he was so desperate. To protect Mr. Stainton, she said carefully, "You mentioned that Miss Blundell had been asking specific questions about wartime events. Did these inquiries focus on any particular incident or individual?" The vicar's face grew pale. She had become obsessed with the tragedy of Rose M.T.'s, a young woman who died during the war. Miss Blundell insisted that Rose's death was not accidental, that someone with influence had silenced her to prevent embarrassing gravations. She claimed to have evidence in her paintings that would prove her theory, evidence of what nature faces. Miss Marple faces and interactions captured in her sketch of sand, later incorporated into her paintings. She said an artist's eye could detect guilt and complicity that others might miss. She had painted scenes from those years with such precision that anyone familiar with the events would recognize the participants and understand the implications. Miss Marple found herself thinking of the missing teacup with its depiction of the war memorial during Remembrance Day. If Verity Blundell had indeed captured comprising evidence in her artistic documentation, then someone had clearly decided that the risk of exposure was worth the terrible gamble of murder. "This person whose confidence you are protecting," she said gently, "are you ascertain they are truly innocent of Miss Blundell's murder?" Mr. Stainton's sanguished expression provided a partial answer. "I cannot believe, and that is the person in question has lived an exemplary life for years, has contributed greatly to the community, has shown genuine remorse for past failings. But I must admit that Miss Blundell's persistent accusations and threats of exposure had caused considerable interests." The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Stainton's return, effectively ending the vicar's uncomfortable revelations. As Miss Marple took her leave, she reflected on the complex web of guilt, loyalty, and moral obligation that the murder had exposed. Someone in Ferncombe was indeed harboring secrets from the war years, secrets that Verity Blundell had threatened to expose through her artistic documentation. The vicar's obvious torment suggested that he knew more than he was willing to reveal, torn between his duty to protect confidences and his obligation to see justice done. Miss Marple suspected that the resolution of this case would require someone to make the difficult choice between personal loyalty and the demands of truth. Walking back through the village in the gathering dusk, she found herself wondering whether the murderer's greatest mistake had been in underestimating an artist's power to capture truth, or in overestimating their ability to destroy evidence of their crime. In her experience, attempts to conceal guilt often served only to highlight it more dramatically, like shadows that grew darker when exposed to brighter light. Chapter 7. The Weight of Truth. Friday morning brought news that sent a ripple of alarm through the village. Inspector Craddock arrived at Maud's cottage shortly after breakfast, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of considerable strain. The theft had occurred sometime during the night, and the implications were both disturbing and revealing. The evidence room at the Red Lion was broken into, he explained grimly to Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry. A most professional job. The lock picked with considerable skill. Nothing disturbed except for one specific item, the remaining teacups from Miss Blundell's studio had been stolen. Miss Marple set down her knitting with careful deliberation. How very interesting, and yet, one might observe, rather pointless. If the murderer was seeking to destroy evidence, surely they would have taken the cups at the time of the crime. Precisely my thinking, Inspector Crouch agreed, which suggests that the killer has only recently realized the significance of what those cups might reveal. Something has changed. Perhaps our investigation has uncovered information that makes their continued existence too dangerous to tolerate. Mrs. Bantry looked bewildered. But what could painted teacups possibly reveal? They were merely village seneschally. Miss Blundell's extraordinary attention to detail, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. As I observed during our work in the studio, she painted with almost photographic precision. Every face, every figure, every architectural detail was rendered with remarkably accuracy. The inspector nodded grimly. We've been making inquiries about fewer time period, particularly regarding the death of Rose M.T. It seems our questions may have prompted someone to take desperate action. Miss Marple found herself thinking of her conversation with Reverend Staten and his obvious anguish about protecting Sumian's confidence. The timing of the theft suggested that recent developments had pushed the killer beyond mere concerning to active panic. Inspector, she said carefully, might I ask whether your inquiries have focused on any particular individuals from that period? We've been examining service records, home guard rosters, and personnel files from the various military units billeted in the village during the war. The process has been complicated by the fact that many records were lost or destroyed, but we've managed to piece out together a fairly comprehensive picture of who was present during the relevant period. This intelligence proved illuminating when Miss Marple encountered Mr. Fortescue later that morning outside the post office. The property developer appeared unusually agitated, normally confident demeanor replaced by nervous energy that manifested in constant movement and distracting conversation. Terrible business this theft, he said, without preamble. Makes one wonder whether the police are competent to handle such matters. Perhaps it's time to call in Scotland Yard specialists. Miss Marple observed his obvious anxiety with interest. I understand the stolen items were Miss Blundell's painted teacups. Surely their value was more sentimental than monetary. Value is relative, Mr. Fortescue replied tersely. Some things are worth far more than their apparent price. With Suggest, Miss Blundell's work was becoming quite sought after. You know, collectors value authenticity and historical accuracy. Indeed, I believe her war domesticates were particularly detailed. The developer's face flushed slightly. Artists often take liberties with historical accuracy for dramatic effect. One shouldn't assume that every detail in a painting reflects actual events. Marple found this defensive response most enlightening, particularly when combined with Mr. Fortescue's obvious desire to terminate their conversation. His nervous energy and frequent glances toward the police station suggested Soam, whose carefully constructed composure was beginning to crack under pressure. The afternoon brought an even more revealing encounter when Miss Marple accepted an invitation to tea with Patricia Hume. The young woman had inherited not only her aunt's cottage, but also the considerable burden of sorting through a lifetime's accumula of artistic materials and personal effects. I've been going through Aunt Ferret's correspondence, Patricia explained as she served tea in the familiar sitting room. She kept of everything: letters, bills, even scraps of paper with notes about her paintings. It's fascinating, but rather overwhelming. Artists often maintain detailed records of their work, Miss Marple observed. Did your aunt keep notes about her wartime paintings? Patricia's expression grew troubled. She did, and some of them are quite disturbing. She seems to have been convinced that certain people in the village were not what they appeared to. She'd made lists of inconsistencies. She'd noticed discrepancies between official records and her own observations. What sort of discrepancies? People who claimed to have been elsewhere during specific events, but whom she'd clearly seen and sketched in different locations. Individuals whose wartime service records didn't match their actual activities as she documented them in her paintings. She was quite methodical about it all. Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing unease. Verity Blundell had clearly been conducting her own investigation into wartime events, using her artistic documentation as evidence to contradict official accounts and personal testimonies. These notes, she said carefully, do they mention specific individuals by name? Patricia nodded reluctantly. Several people, actually some quite prominent members of the community. She seemed particularly interested in anyone who had access to sensitive information during the war. Postal workers, local officials, people billeted with important families. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion. Outside, through the window, they could see Inspector Crock's police car pulling up to the cottage, followed by several other vehicles. The inspector emerged with a grim expression, and several constables clearly prepared for a serious confrontation. "I'm afraid I must ask Yalbeth to remain here," he announced as he entered the sitting room. "We have reason to believe that the person responsible for Miss Blundell's murder may attempt to retrieve certain documents from this cottage." Miss Marple felt a familiar chill of recognition in her. Experienced murderers often returned to the scene of their crime when desperation overcame caution. The theft of the teacups suggested that the killer was still searching for evidence that might implicate them, and Verity Blundell's cottage was the most logical place to continue that search. "Inspector," she said quietly, "might I suggest that Mrs. Hume and I withdraw to the kitchen while you and your men prepare for this visit?" As they settled in the cottage's cozy kitchen to wait, Miss Marple reflected on the various threads of information that had emerged over the past week. Someone in Fernham was harboring secrets from the war years, secrets that Verity Blundell had threatened to expose through her artistic documentation. The theft of the teacups and the anticipated return to the cottage suggested that the killer was still searching for specific evidence that would conclusively link them to both past crimes and the recent murder. The weight of truth, she reflected often, proved heavier than the burden of concealment. Someone in the village was about to discover that the price of maintaining old secrets had become impossibly high, and that the desperate measures they had taken to protect themselves had only served to ensure their eventual exposure. Chapter 8. Justice in the garden. The wait in Rosemary Cottage extended well into the evening, with Inspector Craddock maintaining a vigilant watch while Miss Marple and Patricia sat quietly in the kitchen, the latter growing increasingly nervous as the hours passed. It was nearly 9 o'clock when the sound of careful footsteps in the garden alerted them to an approaching presence. Through the window, Miss Marple observed a shadowy figure moving purposefully toward the studio, carrying what appeared to be a small satchel. The intruder moved with the confidence of someone familiar with the property, avoiding the gravel paths that might announce their presence and keeping to the grass borders where their footsteps would be muffled. Inspector Croak allowed the figure to enter the studio before signaling his constables to surround the building when they switched in their electric torches. The harsh light revealed Mrs. Staton crouched beside Verity Blundell's filing cabinet, her thin hands frantically searching through the deceased artist's papers. "Mrs. Staton," Inspector Craddock said quietly from the doorway, "I think you'd better come with us." The vicar's wife looked up with an expression of such despair that Miss Marple felt a profound sadness. Here was a woman who had clearly been driven to desperate measures by circumstances beyond her control, yet whose fundamental decency remained evident even in her moment of capture. 20 minutes later, they had assembled in the cottage's sitting room. Inspector Crock, Miss Marple, Patricia, Mrs. Staton, and Reverend Staton, who had been summoned from the vicarage. The stolen teacups had been recovered from Mrs. Staton's satchel, along with several pages torn from Verity Blundell's Wordamus. "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that it would be helpful if Miss Staton were to tell us her story. The truth, difficult as it may be, is often less terrible than the secrecy that surrounds it." Mrs. Staton sat with her hands folded in her lap, her thin frame seeming to shrink into itself. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My name wasn't always Staton," she began. "During the war, one was Margaret Pearson. and I worked at the telephone exchange in Little Wickham. The nature of my work meant that I overheard conversations that I perhaps shouldn't have heard. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. Such positions often carried burdens that young women were ill-prepared to bear. There was money offered for certain information. Mrs. Stainton continued, her voice growing stronger. Nothing that seemed truly harmful at the time. Troop movement supply schedules, things that anyone might observe. I told myself I was merely confirming what the Germans probably already knew. Inspector Croc leaned forward with interest. You are passing information to enemy agents, not directly. There was an intermediary, someone who claimed to be working for British intelligence, gathering information about local security weaknesses. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because the money he offered meant I could help my sick mother and my younger brothers. Reverend Stainton reached over to take his wife's hand, his face bearing the expression of a man who had long carried the burden of this knowledge. Rose Emmett discovered what you were doing, Miss Marple said gently. That was why she had to die. Mrs. Stainton's composure finally cracked and tears began flowing down her cheeks. Rose worked at the post office, and she'd begun noticing patterns in the mail deliveries. Questions about why certain letters arrived irregularly. She was much cleverer than anyone gave her credit for. She started watching me, following me to my meetings. And when she confronted you, she wanted money. To keep quiet, not because she was greedy, but because she was desperate. Her young man had abandoned her when she told him about the baby, and she needed funds to leave the village before her condition became obvious. He might have managed to pay her, but then she demanded something else. Miss Marple waited patiently for the crucial revelation. She wanted me to identify the father of her child. She'd realized that her lover was the same man who'd recruited me. Fourth intelligence work, the man I'd been passing information to. She thought if she could prove his identity and his activities, she could force him to acknowledge the baby and provide for its future. But this man was not actually working for British intelligence, Inspector Craddock observed. No, he was working for the Germans, and both Rose and I had become dangerous to him. When Rose arranged to meet him at the Rivertoe, discussed terms, I knew she was walking into terrible danger. I followed her that night, intending to warn her, but I arrived too late. He'd already silenced her. And you said nothing. Mrs. Stainton's voice dropped to a whisper. He said you would expose my activities to the authorities. If I spoke, I would have faced charges of treason, possibly execution. I was young and terrified, and I told myself that speaking out wouldn't bring Rose back. Miss Marple found herself thinking of the missing teacup and its significance. Miss Blundell had painted the Remembrance Day ceremony with her usual precision. What did that painting reveal? Faces, Mrs. Stainton replied simply. Miss Blundell had captured the moment when wreaths were being laid at the memorial. In the background of her painting, she'd included spectators watching the ceremony. One of those faces belonged to the man who'd recruited Meth Man who'd killed Rose. He'd returned to the village years later under a different identity, thinking himself safe. Mr. Clement Fortescue, Miss Marple said with quiet certainty. Mrs. Stainton nodded miserably. He'd built a new life. He is a successful businessman, married, well-established himself in respectable Sishi. But Miss Blundell's artistic memory was too precise. She'd painted him exactly as he'd appeared during the war, and she'd begun asking questions about his presence at events where he claimed never to have been. So when Miss Blundell threatened to expose this connection, you felt you had no choice but to silence her. She came to the vicarage last Saturday evening after her garden party. She'd figured out my wartime identity and my connection to Rose's death. She said she intended to present her evidence to the police unless I confessed publicly to my role in the espionage activities. She showed me the painted teacup depicting the memorial ceremony, pointing out Fortescue's face in the crowd and explaining how she'd connected him to the wartime intelligence network. Inspector Croc made careful notes while Mrs. Stainton completed her confession. The details emerged slowly, the desperate struggle in the studio, when Verity Blundell refused to be dissuaded from her course, the panic-head theft of the incriminating teacup, the subsequent realization that other painted cups might also contain damaging evidence. I never intended to hurt anyone, Mrs. Stainton concluded. I've spent years trying to atone for my wartime failings through charitable work and devotion to the parish. But when faced with the prospect of exposure and disgrace, I found that I was still the same frightened girl who'd chosen self-preservation over justice for poor Rose. As the police led Mrs. Stainton away, Miss Marple reflected on the tragedy of the situation. An artist's dedication to truth and historical accuracy had ultimately provided the key to solving not one murder, but two separated by more than 5 years, but connected by the same fundamental motive. The desperate Disaretto keeps shameful secrets buried. The case had demonstrated once again that humanity remained remarkably consistent across time and circumstance. Fear, guilt, and the instinct for self-preservation could drive even fundamentally decent people to terrible acts, while the weight of unconfessed sin grew heavier with each passing year until it became unbearable in the garden, where Verity Blundell had died, pursuing her vision of artistic truth. Justice had finally been served, though at a cost that would leave lasting scars on the small community of Fernham. The painted teacups recovered from Mrs. Stainton's desperate theft would serve as lasting testimony to the power of art to preserve truth long after those who would suppress it had passed from the scene. Thanks for joining us for the case of the painted teacups. Did you suspect that Miss Stainton's wartime secrets would lead to murder when Miss Marple first noticed the missing teacup? Were you able to piece together the connection between Rose EMTT's tragic death and Verity Blundell's artistic documentation? Let me know your thoughts in the comments if you enjoyed this investigation with Miss Marple. Don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, remember Miss Marple's wisdom. An artist's eye for truth can be more dangerous than any weapon, and the past has a way of demanding justice, no matter how carefully we try to bury it.